What's going on, you guys? Got another great episode of Jimmy Rants in store for you today, and I'll let you guys come on in here, make yourselves at home. You like the new set? I haven't really asked anybody, what do you think about the new set? I love the background now. I got this nice couch I could just kick back my feet, chillax with, or whatever. So got nice lighting. So guys, we are here today, and good news, Jimmy Rants fans. I have decided to shift away momentarily from the childhood trauma stuff. I put out a poll on Instagram today on my stories, and 81% of you have said, please talk about keto diet and health. And I kind of get that. I mean, you follow me. I've got 19,000 followers on Instagram, and you follow me because of the keto and the health stuff. A lot of you did interact with the childhood trauma stuff, and so don't get me wrong, I think a lot of you did like it, and that's 19% of my audience, so 1 out of 5 loved the childhood trauma stuff, but a few people didn't. In fact, just yesterday I saw I lost 200 followers on Instagram, so I'm like, okay, so people aren't telling me they don't necessarily like that childhood trauma stuff. Today they did very explicitly tell me, so and that's cool. I want to make the show something that's usable for you. I've never pretended to be a dictator with this content. I want to provide you content that's useful. And so we're going to shift away from the childhood trauma stuff today to get more into some diet and health news. And the one I have for you today is really juicy, guys. So I can't wait to share it with you. But I'm not done with childhood trauma. I hope you know that. I hope you know there's a whole lot more to say. I think we can mix it up. And trying to find that right mix is going to be the trick for me, because when you start talking childhood trauma, it can be heavy, and some of the stories I shared were very heavy, and I got a lot more of those to share, but I think having some of the good stuff happening in the diet and health realm is going to be helpful. So, what I want to talk about today is a press release that I got from the Nutrition Coalition. So you guys know that this is the group, nonprofit group that was created by Nina Teicholz. She's the New York Times bestselling author of The Big Fat Surprise. Came out several years ago now, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when her book came out. And it was all about how we've been lied to about the detrimental effects of saturated fat, and how the recommendations for lowering saturated fat in the diet that have shown up in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans was probably wrong. Now, she's a trained investigative journalist, so she really looked into this. She looked up the research. She saw what it said, and it said a whole lot of nothing. So she created Nutrition Coalition as a way to try to influence the dietary guidelines. So for those of you that don't know, the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and the United States Department of Health and Human Services, they come together every 5 years. The last one was 2015. And so we're in that year where they are formulating the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And these guidelines are supposedly based on the latest and greatest science in nutritional health. And they get these so-called experts on this Dietary Advisory Committee for the Dietary Guidelines, and they're supposed to make recommendations that are based on the science. Well, the problem is the government's involved, so that's the first problem. The second problem is these people on the advisory committee tend to be handpicked, knowing what they're going to put in the guidelines. And it's unfortunate that that's the way it works. I remember in 2010, if you've read my book, Keto Clarity, then you know in the introduction to my book, Keto Clarity, I tell the story about how I went to Washington, D.C., and I testified in front of that Dietary Guidelines Committee all about why I think they need to be embracing a more low-carb approach, why fats are not as unhealthy as we make them out to be, why the carbs that they're promoting are actually promoting disease, raising insulin, raising inflammation levels. I shared from my heart as a layperson in front of the committee. So if you didn't read Keto Clarity, go read it or blow off the dust of it if you've had it for a while. Reread that opening chapter and you'll see where I talked to this very committee. So that committee, you guys, is in the midst of hearing from people and hearing from groups like the Nutrition Coalition. And so there was a letter that was sent to the Secretary of the USDA and the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, urging them with an important policy change for the dietary guidelines. Headline: leading scientists agree current limits on saturated fats no longer justified. Now, you guys who've been following me for a very long time, you realize we have been sold a bill of goods when it comes to saturated fat. We have been told that the sole reason for heart disease is because we consume saturated fat from red meat and fatty dairy and things like that. And that's how we get heart disease. And yet we know there's never been a single study that has ever found that to be true. Not a single one. And yet it's still out there in the zeitgeist. You ask the average person, what is the cause of heart disease? Oh, eating red meat. Oh, drinking milk, eating dairy, all of these things that have saturated fat in them. Butter. They claim all of these real foods are somehow harmful to you because they have saturated fat in them, and we know that clogs your arteries and it gives you heart disease. So I wrote a book about this 7 years ago now. It came out, called Cholesterol Clarity. If you've never heard of that before, I encourage you to pick it up. It definitely will give you a little more insights as to what that fat is doing good in your body and not detrimental. And we know that the really bad thing that's happening in your body has nothing at all to do with your cholesterol levels, has nothing at all to do with your saturated fat intake. It has everything to do with what is inflaming your body. And the biggest inflammers in your body are, surprise, surprise, carbohydrates, especially the refined ones like sugars, refined grains, but even the so-called healthy whole grains and some of those kinds of foods are also highly inflammatory. And then the vegetable oils. These are the seed oils that canola oil, the corn oil, pretty much everything that is a packaged food that has fat in it almost invariably has vegetable oils in it, along with lots of crappy garbage. So let me read from this. Following a 2-day Washington, D.C. based workshop entitled Saturated Fats, a Food or Nutrient Approach, a group of leading nutrition scientists, mainly from the U.S., released a consensus statement detailing their findings on the latest research regarding the intake of saturated fats and heart disease. After a rigorous review of the evidence, the expert group agreed that the most rigorous and current science fails to support a continuation of the government's policy limiting consumption of saturated fat. Guys, if this gets through to the Dietary Guidelines Committee, it's huge. They have been recommending that we eat no more than 10% of our diet as saturated fat. 10%. And I want to say that's where they raised it to 10% in the last one. It has been as low as just I think 5%. And we now know that there is no evidence that shows there's any harm whatsoever that comes from the consumption of saturated fat. Saturated fat alone is not a causal factor in any disease, and I dare anyone watching this right now to show me a study that shows, isolated from all other factors, that saturated fat alone leads to heart disease in humans. Show me the randomized controlled trial that shows that. It doesn't exist, by the way, so nobody will be able to do that. There are epidemiological studies and observational studies and other forms of bad science, animal-based studies that might show that there is some kind of heart disease development. Sometimes those studies looking at like rabbits, for example, they will force feed them saturated fat. Now, their natural diet doesn't include saturated fat to the level that they were feeding them, but they force feed it into them, and then they get heart disease. Oh, see? Saturated fat leads to heart disease. And, of course, we're all like rabbits, right? No, we're not rabbits. We're human beings. And so if we're human beings, don't you want human beings being studied? Of course you do. And yet they haven't done those studies. And yet we have formulated policy all on conjecture. We have formulated this policy that has vilified saturated fat, which has always been innocent. Vilified saturated fat in any food that contains it. Butter, red meat, coconut oil. I could go on and on with all the things, dairy, that have saturated fat in them. And there's never been any evidence that they've been harmful whatsoever. So now we've got a group of scientists that have come together and they've had a consensus statement saying, look, we have looked at the evidence. We don't see any signs that saturated fat should be limited in any way. Now, let me make the caveat. This doesn't mean we're all going to go eat tubs of lard and coconut oil and butter and just eat it straight up. There's this kind of meme online about me that says I encourage people to eat whole sticks of butter, and I'm just sitting there just like Paula Deen, just stuffing butter down my throat. I'm not real sure where that comes from. I've never really talked about that at all, at least in a serious manner. Perhaps I was joking, but anyway. That's the internet for you. They will run with one little thing and act like you do it all the time. In fact, I haven't had butter in so long. I try to get most of my saturated fat intake with what comes naturally with the meats that I eat. So I've shifted over pretty much to mostly carnivore type of keto diet. Still very high in fat, the natural fats that come with it. I've been on a ribeye kick lately, so I've been eating quite a few ribeyes. In fact, I had 2 of them a couple of hours ago. And it's delicious, and you get all of that fat in there, saturated fat in there, without having to add any extra fat to it. Members of the workshop who met February the 10th and 11th included 3 former members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee who met from 1995 through 2015, as well as the chair of the 2005 Dietary Guidelines Committee. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is an expert group appointed every 5 years. Their role is to review all the latest science for the government's nutrition policy, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the DGA, and make recommendations to the 2 agencies in the government that jointly issue those guidelines, and that is the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. So, this advisory committee is charged. Go find the science and then report back to the government agencies in the executive branch to tell them what you found. The problem with that is they haven't always looked at all the science. Because here we are in 2020, and some of the first ketogenic research projects and papers that came out were in the late 90s, when people like Dr. Eric Westman, my friend Dr. Westman, and Jeff Volek and Steve Finney and various ones, Dr. Will Yancey, another big researcher in the early days, all of these guys were out there putting in the time, doing well-formulated studies, and showing the efficacy of a low carbohydrate diet that included saturated fats. And guys, plain and simple, the USDA has just ignored them. The USDA is highly aware of these really good studies. And it's studies on humans. Now, a lot of the studies in the early days were smaller. And since then, obviously, we've had some really great studies come out. The Christopher Gardner studies, if you missed those from about 13 years ago, I remember that when it came out. The SHI study. There's so many really good research papers. Anybody that pretends like we don't have good evidence for low carb, ketogenic, high fat, saturated fat type of diets, you're blind, because they're out there and they're still coming out. And because of the popularity of keto over the past few years, we're seeing a lot of scientists taking a really close look at this because so many people are eating this way. So this group of scientists got together with these former members of the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and they were examining this really closely and came to this consensus statement. So let's see what that's about. Members of the group wrote a consensus statement on saturated fats. They sent a letter regarding these findings to the secretaries of the USDA and the Health and Human Services. The letter stated, "There is no strong scientific evidence that the current population-wide upper limits on commonly consumed saturated fats in the U.S. will prevent cardiovascular disease or reduce mortality. A continued limit on these fats is therefore not justified." Guys, this, if it's actually embraced, and we'll talk about whether I think it will be or not here in a minute, but if this is actually embraced, this is revolutionary. This will be a real game changer. Not the one that's the vegan propaganda film. This will be the game changer. If they can say that saturated fat is not a nutrient of concern, that we can now have no limitations on it, that would be big, you guys. And it's true. The letter also urged the USDA HHS to give serious and immediate consideration to lifting those limits that are placed on saturated fat intake for the upcoming 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So it is 2020. They are charged to put out these new guidelines that will be the guidelines for the next 5 years by the end of the year. So sometime within the next 10 months, we're going to have these dietary guidelines come out. And how cool would it be if those restrictions on saturated fat are finally lifted? Now, I will tell you this, even if they do lift it, even if they do make a big deal of, oh yeah, sorry, we were wrong about saturated fat being something you needed to limit, how many people are actually going to start eating it again? We have been so propagandized that saturated fat is unhealthy for us that people still won't believe it. So while I love the effort, and while I love that it's science-based and you got all these people who are coming together and saying, hey, look, we realize the science doesn't show this, let's get this out here, it's still going to be a problem. Excuse me, girls, my cats are starting to fight. Of course they are. Don't you know I'm doing a live show? Shut up. My cats. Wouldn't it be amazing, though, if this actually showed up? Because it would be really cool. But again, I don't think you're going to get dietitians to change their mind. I don't think you're going to get doctors to stop promoting, oh, you need to cut back on the saturated fat. It's so deeply ingrained in our culture that the average person on the street still can't wrap their head around it. Maybe you're eating keto now, and maybe even you still are kind of like, yeah, I'm eating it, but I'm not so sure. Because it's been such a part of our culture for so long, it's hard to let that go, right? Dr. Janet King, the chair of the 2005 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, as well as a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences and Toxicology at UC Berkeley, she said, we agreed that there is no evidence that the current population-wide upper limits on commonly consumed saturated fats in the U.S. will prevent cardiovascular disease or reduce mortality. Might reduce mentality too if you don't eat saturated fats. Amazing. I mean, this is the person that was the chair 15 years ago of that very committee that they're writing to. And she's saying very clearly here, and she's at UC Berkeley, they're usually a little more progressive thinking about things. So this is really good, you guys. Since the launch of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, that was in 1980, Americans have been advised to consume a diet that is low in saturated fats. In 2005, they added a specific limit of 10% of your calories coming from these fats. So the original one just said low, and they left it to you to assume what low meant. 2005, they said 10%, and this recommendation is still the recommendation to this day. For the 2020 Dietary Guidelines, the USDA HHS Advisory Committee has stated that it will update the recommendations for saturated fats with a report that will be due out in mid-May. So guys, stay tuned. When that mid-May statement comes out about saturated fat, this could be huge. And let me tell you, the last one in 2015, there was a big revelation that did not get a lot of attention. And see if you knew this. In 2015, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee actually said that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. Did you know that was in the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, that dietary cholesterol is not something you should be limiting anymore? It's not a nutrient that's going to harm you. Did you know that? I would dare say most people watching this right now have never heard that. Now, I've talked about it quite a bit right after it happened, and I've tried to repeat it on podcasts that I've been on, but the mainstream media and the Dietary Guidelines Committee themselves, they didn't make a big deal about it, but it was a huge philosophical change when it comes to cholesterol and eating cholesterol, because the notion was if you eat cholesterol, you raise your blood cholesterol, blah, blah, blah. But we now know that's simply not true. You can eat all the cholesterol in the world. Your body isn't going to raise cholesterol from you eating cholesterol. If you hold back cholesterol intake, guess what? Your body naturally raises it internally without you consuming any at all. There is a natural regulatory process in the body that keeps the proper amounts of cholesterol in your body at all times. So if you eat more, it doesn't produce as much internally. But if you don't eat enough, it starts doing that production endogenously, is what that's called. The guidelines determine school lunches, hospital food, feeding programs for the elderly, and the military food. Indeed, they influence our entire food supply. It is therefore critical that these guidelines be based on the best possible science, including the most up-to-date understanding on saturated fats and their effects on health. That was from Dr. Ronald Krauss. I've had him on the Living La Vida Low Carb show before. He was one of the workshop's 2 co-chairs. He's a professor of pediatrics and medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. He's also at the Dolores Jordan Endowed Chair at UCSF. If you read my book, Cholesterol Clarity, he was one of my Moment of Clarity quote people in that book. Another one of the co-chairs was Dr. Arne Astrup. He's a professor, head of Department of Nutrition, Exercise, and Sports at the University of Copenhagen. And he said, in Denmark, by the way, the approach to look at saturated fat as one group and to predict health effects of individual foods, meals, and diets based on the total content of saturated fat is likely to lead to erroneous conclusions. So what he's talking about there is a lot of the studies that supposedly put saturated fat in a bad light, they don't just isolate saturated fat. They include a lot of carbohydrates usually. They include a lot of things that could be causal factors in heart disease. And so if the person develops heart disease and they had a hamburger, for example, they blame the saturated fat in the red meat, but not the bun. Not the French fries they ate with their McDonald's supersized meal. You see how they play the game of pretending like it's one thing because that's what they have preconceived in their head is the causal factor? And yet when you parse it out, they've never done a study where all they look at is just saturated fat. I would even love it if they did a study that just looked at meat, red meat consumption. In other words, all they eat is red meat. So all you carnivore people out there, I'm included in that. Study us. Show us eating a bunch of ribeye. You pay for my ribeyes. I would love to be a part of your study. You can buy me 4 ribeyes a day and I'll be a happy camper. And I guarantee you there will be no detrimentalness to heart health found. In fact, every single time I've done what's called a CT heart scan, that is a CAT scan of your chest cavity, and you look for a heart calcium score, that coronary calcium score comes back a big fat 0. And when you get a 0, that means you're not going to develop much coronary plaque. This is hard plaque I'm referring to. There is debate about whether that test shows the soft plaque, hard plaque, but the point is, once it's calcified, it's hard plaque, that's heart disease developing. And I've had a big fat 0, which shows no heart disease, despite a very high intake of saturated fat. So what they're talking about here is that very thing. We need to stop pretending like it's the saturated fat that is causing people to develop heart disease, which is why we don't need to limit it anymore. Future recommendations, Dr. Astrup continued, should move away from a nutrient-based analytical strategy to more of a food-based approach, and we hope that these considerations will be taken into account before the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee's scientific report is issued in May. So, they've been isolating saturated fat as a nutrient. What Dr. Astrup is saying is, let's start looking at foods. And the reason he says this, you guys, is when you start looking at food, what is the category of food that is causing the most disease right now? That's right. It's processed foods. It's junk food. It's fast food. And when you identify those as causal factors in disease and not a random nutrient like saturated fat or cholesterol, when you start identifying the very foods that are causing the problem, sugar, when you identify those things by name, you're going to get somewhere. You are. A critically important consideration regarding saturated fat is the growing recognition by scientists in the field that the effect of these fats on health cannot be considered in isolation. That's what we just talked about. Instead, they must be analyzed as part of the larger food matrix, which means the composition of specific foods in which these fats exist. It is now known that the impact of nutrients on health needs to be considered in the context of their overall diet. For example, the other nutrients and foods that people consume, the type and degree of food processing that a food undergoes, and other crucial factors like a person's metabolic health and a propensity for disease. I love every bit of this because they're talking about food quality. So let's talk about real food. Nobody got heart disease from eating real food. You get heart disease from eating processed junk, what I now refer to as crappy garbage. That's how you do it. And so you got this food processing. And then I love that they threw in there crucial factors like a person's metabolic health. This is where insulin resistance comes into play. This is where inflammatory markers, this is where things that might be X factors as to why foods react in one person one way, in a negative way, and then those same foods react in another person differently, which means some people can probably handle having some grains, for example, and another person needs to stay completely away from the grains. And the only difference between those two people is their metabolism and their propensity for disease, which can be genetic, it can be other factors as well. For example, some foods like dark chocolate, whole-fat dairy, and unprocessed meats have a relatively high saturated fat content, but there's no association with any increase in the cardiovascular risk. So, the conclusions by these researchers, and these are leading researchers in the field of nutritional health, they found that numerous recent meta-analysis of both controlled randomized trials as well as observational studies found that there was no significant evidence for the effects of saturated fat consumption on cardiovascular disease or total mortality, which is death. Furthermore, there is evidence that saturated fat intake may be associated with a lower risk of getting a stroke. So when you eat enough fat in your diet, it's actually neuroprotective, but we knew that already. This is not breaking news. But guys, if this becomes a part of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines, huge paradigm shift. And we need to be thankful for the keto movement kind of putting this on the radar screen. I don't know if they're actually going to make this in their statement in May, but how cool would that be if this becomes a thing? They also conclude that recommendations to lower saturated fat consumptions have been based primarily on the evidence that this will lower the LDL cholesterol, which is the type of cholesterol in the blood that's been linked to heart disease risk. However, it is now known that there is more than one type of LDL, and that in the majority of individuals, reducing dietary saturated fat does not lower the negative type of LDL, that's the small dense LDL particles, I'll come back to that in a second, that is most strongly associated with heart disease risk. This may help to explain why lowering saturated fat intake in trials has not been found to reduce cardiovascular mortality. So, quick little primer on LDL and that there's different types. I realize there's a lot of people that know this already, so if you know this, don't tune me out, just consider it a refresher. For the rest of you, maybe you don't realize LDL isn't just one number. On your cholesterol test at your doctor, you go run what's called an LDL-C. LDL-C is an estimated number based on the Friedewald equation. This is an equation where they throw your HDL and your triglycerides and the VLD. They throw all these other numbers into this equation and out pops your LDL. Well, the problem with using LDL-C is when you eat keto, for example, and you eat low amounts of carbs, your triglycerides are low. Usually they're below 100 and usually significantly below 100. The other thing that happens is you eat more fat on a ketogenic diet. So when you eat more fat, that raises your HDL cholesterol. So you have higher HDL, generally over 50, lower triglycerides, generally under 100. And when those two numbers are in that range, guess what happens to that estimation calculation of your LDL? It's overestimated. So then you get this really high LDL number on your cholesterol test, which then boosts your total cholesterol in addition to having a high HDL cholesterol, and your doctor goes bat crap crazy trying to push a statin medication on you. Anybody experienced that before? Yeah, it's happened to a lot of us. In fact, here on Instagram, Bonnie wrote to me the other day. She's probably on here now. And Bonnie told me, oh yeah, the doctor's freaking out. What do I do? Send me your numbers. Her total cholesterol was not bad. It was like 260 or whatever it was. Her LDL was high, but her triglycerides were something like 65, and her HDL was 70. And I'm like, this doctor has not kept up with the science. And they just push those statin medications on you like they're TikToks. And they're bad news, guys. Read my book, Cholesterol Clarity. And thankfully, Bonnie had a copy of my book, and I encouraged her to read certain chapters to calm her brain down. But LDL isn't just that calculated number. You can have the LDL particles tested. And there's two primary sizes of LDL. You got the large fluffy kind of LDL particles. This is considered pattern A. And then you have the small, dense, BB-sized LDL. That's considered pattern B. Pattern A is what you want. Pattern A, if you have triglycerides under 100, you have HDL cholesterol over 50, I can almost bet without a shadow of a doubt that your LDL particles will be pattern A. Almost invariably. And that's good. That's what you want. So it's not about the total number of LDL-C that's in your on your test. You want to know what the breakdown is. So there are a few companies you can run this particle size test. The one I like the best is the NMR lipoprofile test, which is out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and it's from LipoScience is the name of the company. There's a couple of other really good ones out there. The VAP test, VAP, but you can look it up. And in fact, you could even look up particle size test online, and you'll find these tests. If your trigs are under 100 and your HDL is over 50, I don't think you need to run an NMR. The only time you would run the NMR is if your number, like your trigs were 125 and your HDL was, say, 30. You want to kind of see what's going on with the LDL particles. But nobody ever talks about the breakdown of the LDL particles. And this is the other thing about this situation with saturated fat. This is the thing about saturated fat. They always say it raises your LDL cholesterol. And they always blame a raising of the LDL cholesterol on heart disease. But what if you're eating real food-based saturated fats? What if that is raising your LDL, but it's raising it in the good way? And there's so many good things that are a part of your cholesterol panel, and LDL is one of the better. I'll tell you what, if you've got inflammation in your body and you artificially lower your cholesterol levels, which it's usually lowering that large fluffy kind of LDL, if you lower that, you put yourself at a higher risk of heart disease. This is why those people that cut down on the amount of saturated fat in their diet, guess what happens? The blood levels of saturated fat go way up. Way up. Dr. Volek actually did this study. Dr. Jeff Volek, back in 2006, he did this study where they cut down on the amount of saturated fat, and then they looked for saturated fat in the blood. And they found that there was an increase in the amount of saturated fat in the blood. Why? Because saturated fat in the blood was a good thing. And when you don't feed it that basic raw material in the form of butter and red meat and dairy and all the things, your body adapts and it makes its own saturated fat. This thing that causes heart disease can be made by your body. But inversely, when you eat more saturated fat, listen to this. When you eat more saturated fat, you end up having less fat in your blood. Amazing, right? But we've got it all backwards, which is why I love that this scientific committee got together. And there was no funding from any industry groups, by the way, for getting together and coming up with this consensus. No funding from any industry. The meat industry, the dairy industry, none of these guys paid them any money. The Nutrition Coalition helped put that on. But this is big, guys. Now, reality check. Is this actually going to change anything? I've been at this for a very long time, and I've been around since the 2005 Dietary Guidelines. I testified before the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Committee, 2015, and now 2020. And nothing of consequence, other than 2015, where they said that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. Other than that, there's really been no changes of consequence. So for them to suddenly make a statement that there is no limitation requirements on saturated fat anymore would be a huge policy change. And I'm not so certain that the government is in any hurry to make that radical of a change. I wonder, it's currently 10%. I wonder if they will do it incrementally. So maybe in 2020, they take that 10% and they say, okay, your diet can include up to 15%, like where they like inch closer and do it incrementally. I wonder if that will be the strategy. I have no confidence, and call me a pessimist, but the reality of what I think is going to happen is they're not going to heed these scientists coming together, because unfortunately, while those are very respected scientists and former members of the Dietary Guidelines Committee, it's not enough of them. We need to see thousands of those kinds of people to really maybe make an impact. And never mind, you got lay people out here like myself and a lot of you guys who have eaten a whole lot of saturated fat. We have gotten healthier doing that. Good things have happened for us because we embraced more saturated fat in our diet. But we're not scientists. They don't listen to us. We're just all anecdotes. Now, never mind, it's N equals everybody, and everybody's doing really well who's eating a primarily saturated fat, animal-based food type of diet that's low in carbohydrates. We're all doing well. And so what do they do with that? I'm not hopeful that we're going to see major changes, but if we do, and we have these scientists to thank for putting it on the radar screen, guys, look out. Look out. Now, again, even if they did carte blanche, just say, okay, all of this limitation on saturated fat is lifted, we're not worried about it because there's no evidence. Even if they did that, people are still going to cut their saturated fat because old habits are hard to break. Propaganda is hard to break. And even if dietitians and doctors and all the so-called health experts out there that talk directly to patients, even if they get on board and they decide to start promoting this to their patients, who's going to believe them? They've cried wolf for so long when it comes to saturated fat being a boogeyman. You start to say, oh, psych, we didn't mean that all these years. They're not going to believe you. And people's health will get worse and worse and worse. So while it's great that this got out there, I'm not hopeful that real change is actually going to happen. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. I'm going to go to Instagram, and if we have time at the end, we will go to Facebook. But I'm sure this has got you all fired up today. Thanks for being here, you guys. And yeah, if you joined us late, no childhood trauma stuff today. The tribe has spoken, and about 80+% of you want more keto and health stuff. So I get it. I'm not done with childhood trauma, so I will be returning to that at some point. But for now, we'll do a few more of these kind of health ones. Thank you for changing it up. Trauma is an excellent subject, but I definitely need time to sort through things. Yes, thank you, Beth. I am definitely doing that. All right. Comments on... Oh, Robin says she remembers when I testified 10 years ago. It has been 10 years ago. So nice to see you again. Thank you, Keto Nourish. Appreciate you being here. Awesome news, since I'm looking for 82 to 85% of my fat, calories coming from fat. That's awesome, Keto Stone. I've reduced a lot of my butter intake and moved to cooking with ghee, says Caption KC. Ghee has a lot of saturated fat too, and so if your purpose was to get rid of the milk and the dairy that might like react to your autoimmune, I get it. So, but yeah, it still has a lot of saturated fat. All right, I'm going to take a stab at your name because you corrected me on how to say it. Ilza says, woohoo, South Africa to follow. It does give us a place to start. So in South Africa, you guys have a very interesting movement, thanks to Professor Tim Noakes there, where Banting, which is kind of the version of keto there, took off, and there's Banting restaurants. And so I'd be surprised if you guys don't lead the charge for us. Keto Nerd says big corporate will fight this theory, unfortunately. Oh yeah, big food has a lot to lose. Big food is feeling the pinch, you guys, of the keto movement. Big food does not want people to know that they can eat saturated fat, because guess what? When you cut saturated fat, generally, what do you replace saturated fat with? Processed carbohydrates. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. There will be a pushback on this. It'll take an entire generation of living this way for change to take place. You're probably right. Like the old guard will have to die off, and the new guard will go, oh man, what were they thinking in the 80s and 90s and 2000? What were they thinking? Look, all those years, 40 years of like nutritional ineptitude. Are you people crazy not eating butter? Are you people crazy cutting your saturated fat when we know saturated fat is one of the key nutrients that your body needs to be healthy? You watch, guys. History is not going to look too kindly on 1980 through 2020 if this gets implemented and we start to see real change take place. All that dangerous, quote, fat is healing my husband's atherosclerosis, says R.W. Hempel. It does. Keep preaching, she said. Thankful for you. Thank you. C.M. Clements, I agree until dietitians and doctors are allowed to advise patients about the facts regarding saturated fat and cholesterol without the fear of being sued for malpractice, change will be slow. It's unfortunate. I wish there was some way we could free up dietitians and doctors who have preached the exact opposite. Because I do know that there is a very real fear of a class action lawsuit. If they suddenly start saying that, oops, fat was healthy all along, then all these people that cut their fat and they got unhealthy as a result of doing that, that's a class action lawsuit waiting to happen. Sharon says school lunches definitely need to change. Pizza with a side of fries, fruit, carbs, and more carbs, not helping childhood obesity. No, it's not. And those kids are getting set up for failure once they become an adult. Carrie says, I'll buy my own damn ribeye, just study as carnivores. Ribeyes are expensive, and I was just trying to joyously balanced. Missed you at the NTA conference. Yeah, that was last weekend. I was in consideration to speak. I had put in my name to speak, and I made it to the final list, but then they decided I was like the first out. So hoping I can go back next year. My husband is on a statin, says Carrie. Yeah, a lot of people are. They're put on them, and they just think, oh, that's going to protect me from heart disease. No, it doesn't. Chapter 5 of Cholesterol Clarity, I talk all about statin medications and what they're doing to your body. They increase your risk of diabetes. They increase your risk of cancer. And here's the funniest one, you guys. Statin medications, which are designed and pitched to patients as the way to prevent heart disease and to protect you from having a heart attack, guess what? That's right. They raise your risk of heart disease. Isn't that funny? George says, yes, my doctor's pushing a statin. My LDL 153, triglycerides 46, which is incredible. Good job, George. HDL 69, and he wants it down to 70. I assume you mean the LDL down to 70. Yeah. There's been no evidence that that low of an LDL cholesterol is helpful in any way. BZ says, I love Dave Feldman's assessment of the NHANES data, which showed people who are 100 years old or higher with high LDL cholesterol. If LDL was killing people, they should be the first ones to go. Yeah. In fact, as you age, guys, maybe you're watching this and you're older, 60s, 70s, 80s or above. Did you know that in traditional cultures where there was no heart disease, like none found whatsoever, traditional cultures, they eat real food, they do all the things, they don't have Twinkies, Ding Dongs, Doritos, Coca-Cola, all the stuff we have at our disposal now. in those traditional cultures, when you're that age, your normal total cholesterol, get ready, 300. 300. And that should tell you the role that cholesterol plays in your body as you get older. Now, typically older people start to get more inflammation in the body, and one of the things that cholesterol's purpose is in the body is to help you deal with inflammation. And so when you have higher inflammation levels in your body and you take a medication like a statin to artificially lower this very natural way to deal with inflammation in your body, guess what? You're sitting duck. You're a target to have that very disease you're trying to prevent hit you. If not that disease, maybe Alzheimer's develops, maybe you have diabetes develop, maybe you have cancer develop, all at the altar of let's get that cholesterol lower and lower. And to what end? What's the purpose? To just make that number go down? I don't know about you guys. As I get older, I want my cholesterol to be very high. I'm okay with a 300 total cholesterol. It's good. It's a good thing. We need our cholesterol. Can't wait for it to change. That's right. That's right, Isa. Caption KC, my nurse daughter told me of a woman who was my age who came to the ER with a fatal heart attack. The woman had bad metabolic syndrome. She was on a statin and her cholesterol numbers were, quote, beautiful, end quote. Yeah. Most people who come into a hospital with a cardiovascular event of some sort tend to have normal cholesterol, either naturally or through the use of a statin medication. And that's unfortunate because this narrative that it's high cholesterol that's causing this has been dead wrong for years. I wrote that book, Cholesterol Clarity. I wrote it 8 years ago. And people still worry about this stuff. The information's out there. People just need to wake up. Patty says we need to get this out to the masses. Can you please make information available to post? So yeah, all these videos are at jimmyrants.com, which you can then send people the link. It's also going to be on YouTube, which you can also embed on social media and in various places. So please go check this out after we're done. You can definitely share it that way. Anna says we need major change. Do you know how difficult it is to eat ketogenically at a rehab after a hip replacement? I fast a lot. All the cottage cheese and yogurt full of sugar is low fat. Yeah, my web guy, Hank, actually had to be kept overnight last night. He had some fluid buildup, and so he was showing me a picture of some of the food that they were serving him. And of course, it was vegetable oil margarine and crappy garbage, and yeah, it's bad. But yeah, this is one of the things that if this gets implemented into the guidelines, I'm hoping hospital food does change for the better. Yania says, awesome. I am 5 weeks into carnivore. I find myself stalling a lot. Still have another 20 pounds to my ideal weight. It's a little discouraging. Well, don't make it about weight. Make it about your health, and then the weight will follow. CM Clement says, can't wait to see you at Adapt Atlanta. So yeah, I'm coming up. I got 2 speaking events. Winchester, Virginia in about a week from this weekend. And then Atlanta, Georgia, 2 weekends from now. So real excited to speak. Don't blame the butter for what the bread did, says 2Fix MJ. That's true. That is true. Anna says, no choices but cheeseburgers each dinner. I also ask for real butter with each tray. I make a fatty coffee for breakfast and lunch. Now it was reported that I won't eat. Weird. That's crazy. Joyously balanced. I've lost over 240 pounds. The healthier portion of that was when I started eating real food, which included a lot of saturated fat. Yeah. 2Fix MJ, 0 calcium score, HDL up, triglycerides down with keto, 18 months 120 pounds now, down from 184. That's awesome. R.W. Hempel, I believe we have more mental illness in this country because of the lack of healthy fats. Our poor children will be in trouble if things don't change. I agree. I think for most of us who eat keto, we might have started as a weight loss journey, but when we started feeling our brains on fire, that was the best part. That was the part that got us to go, oh, if I don't lose a pound, I'll do it for this noggin up here to be as sharp as it is. And I've always felt great when I've been eating keto because my brain is on fire and I can just... Holly says my blood pressure dropped to 130/80 from 140/90 just being on carnivore. Yeah, that will happen. That's for sure. All right, crap. There it goes. I was like, it stuck on me there for a second. Heather says, yes, boyfriend has chronic pancreatitis. They first fed him Jell-O, Italian ices, and soda, then ice cream to rest the pancreas. Oh my God. All of that's supposed to rest your pancreas? I think your pancreas is probably on fire. I've been keto and carnivore over 2 years. The bulk of my coworkers got together and started intermittent fasting, did not say anything to me. They act like they invented it. Last year, it was, quote, unhealthy. Yeah. Change takes time. Change takes time. B-Deb Mom says, how do you feel about higher protein on carnivore? Carnivore does not have to be high protein. If you put the emphasis on fatty meats, like ribeyes and like other forms of fatty meats, I think it could be perfectly keto. You don't have to be high protein just because you're only eating meat. All right, let's. We got a little bit of time left that we can address you guys over here on Facebook. And once again, I can't see your comments, or I would be addressing you as well. All right, let's see what you got to say. When has the USDA ever put the health of the nation over big food? Thank you, Nancy. That's true. And literally, United States Department of Agriculture. What are their interests? That's right, agriculture. Bonnie says doctors still push cholesterol pills when they think you're high, even when they come out with a report that cholesterol is not a concern. Yep. Well, you got to remember, they get some kickbacks for recommending statin medications. I'm getting the heart calcium test today. I pray it comes out good. You helped me tell the doctor about that test, so thank you. You're welcome. Let me know how it goes. Carbohydrates in the form of processed garbage needs to be eradicated. I hear, Nancy. Maria says, I love how you explain things and call garbage what it is. Keep telling it like it is in simple and easy ways to understand. Be blessed always. Nice to see and hear you. That's always been my jam. How can we make this understandable to the masses? Because most people simply don't know any of this stuff, which has kind of been my forte in this community. What's too much MCT oil? When you start having poopy pants, don't eat too much. How's that for ending this show? When you have poopy pants, we are running out of time now, so let's go. Let's see. Totally agree about the mental illness on the rise because of starving kids of healthy saturated fats. Brain needs fat. It does. Keto nourished. My type 1 son won't stay keto. His cholesterol numbers are bad. Are statins something he should use? I have talked to some medical doctors, and several of them say the only reason they ever put a patient on a statin medication is if they refuse to do diet. At least they get a fighting chance at that point. Now, that's not to say that the statin is good, but it is to say that if you're going to keep eating crap and keep raising your inflammation levels, one of the hallmarks of statin drugs is it's anti-inflammatory. So that's the mechanism that they think it might provide some benefit, but then there's side effects that raise diabetes and cancer and heart disease and kind of all of these things. So they're bad news. Just eat real food. Heather says, discharge him with orders with low-fat diet and whole grains. Oh, man. Bullock in 2018, I've told my family if I end up in a hospital to bring me keto chow shakes with some real butter. That's awesome. No statin sales, no Maui vacations. Oh, that's true, Bullock. You're definitely as jaded as I am about this. All right, guys, that is all the time we have for this episode of Jimmy Rants. As always, jimmyrants.com or YouTube is where you can access these on demand. Thank you so much for being here. Come back later. Got another one. It's not childhood trauma. We'll see you then.